Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Cywes, the CarbAddictionDoc, and today we're going to be talking about hypertension, elevated blood pressure. There's a whole host of causes of reasons why people get high blood pressure. The one we're going to focus on is by far the most common. 95 to 99% of all people, certainly in this country, in America, who have hypertension, have something called essential hypertension. What does the word essential mean? We don't know. So when we don't know about something, we either try to figure out what the cause is or we make assumptions, and you know what assumptions do. Okay? So let's break this down. Let's unpack essential hypertension. The way that blood pressure is regulated, it's pretty simple. The way blood pressure is regulated is by three factors. Number one, the power of the pump. Your heart is a pump, and it's squeezing blood through the body, through the arteries. And hypertension is measured in the large arteries or the medium-sized arteries of your body, typically in the brachial artery. Sometimes you can put a little probe into the radial artery. Those are the two commonest places we measure blood pressure directly. So we have standard normal tables for blood pressure, but here's the interesting thing. The blood pressure standard tables, where you take, let's say, 100,000 people, you measure their blood pressure, you come up with a curve, and you use the standard deviations to decide what's normal and what's abnormal. That's the way these metrics are made. But they're all made, all the hypertension tables were built around a diet that might actually have caused hypertension. So standard blood pressure tables are actually erroneously high. Now, let's go through, so we're measuring brachial or radial artery blood pressure, and the normal one is so-called 120/80. That's what they call normal. And certainly if you're above 140/90, that for most adults is considered to be hypertension, treatable hypertension. And most of the time we don't know what the cause is. Well, number one, the pump itself, the heart, is squeezing on a regular rate. The standard American diet, normal heart rate is 72. I would tell you that the standard human heart rate is probably somewhere around 48 to 60, much lower than that. Mine averages between 48 and 54 on average, my heart rate. But the pump is pumping, and it creates a certain pressure that runs from my heart through my aorta, through my subclavian artery to my brachial artery. That's where we measure the blood pressure, okay? So it's a direct measure of the pump itself. That's the first thing. The second thing that governs the blood pressure is the elasticity and the narrowness of the pipe, and its radius to the fourth power, r to the fourth power, which is the diameter, the radius of the artery that determines the back pressure. So if my arteries are tiny and rigid, there's going to be much greater pressure. You've got a pumping against this metal tube, as opposed to thinking about it as being more of a balloon, more elastic, where there's a certain amount of, as the heart pumps, it stretch happens and the arteries can dilate. So you can get dilation or opening up of those arteries, and for every small move, it's radius to the fourth power that changes the diameter of the pipes, and also the size of the blood flow to those pipes. Remember, the more pipes you have lined up, the lower that pressure is. I'll give you a simple example. The narrowest part of the airway is right here in my voice box. The trachea is the largest pipe going to the lungs. But because there's only one trachea, it's actually the narrowest part. Then it divides into two bronchi, and then each of those has other branches, which actually increases the surface area. So the pressure for breathing is up here. Same thing when it leaves the heart. The highest blood pressure is in the aorta because it's one pipe. Now you've got branches that are filtering that and decreasing the pressure as it goes further. So your central blood pressure is much higher over here than it is over here than it might be in my finger. The further from the heart you get, the lower the pressure is. That seems pretty obvious. And then the third component of pressure is volume. The amount of blood that each pump, the bolus, that wave of blood that gets squirted out of the heart when it pumps, based on the elasticity and the narrowness of the width of the blood vessels, that amount of blood is also critically important. Now, the human body, in a very complex way, regulates heart rate, the amount that the heart fills and squeezes each time. It regulates the narrowness and the elasticity of the pipes, and it regulates the volume. What is the quarterback of blood volume and blood pressure? Salt. 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 Sodium chloride. Sodium. Sodium channels. Sodium salt is the molecule that regulates blood pressure and blood volume, and to a certain indirect extent, heart rate, which is the rate at which the pump pumps. Remember, the faster the heart pumps, the less it fills per stroke. So your stroke volume goes down, the faster that beat is. If it's only pumping 30 or 40 or 40 or 50 beats per minute, it's a much larger volume that it typically fills with than if it's pumping at 160 beats per minute in tachycardia, where you're getting very little volume going through there, even though it's pumping a lot. Okay? However, salt is what the human body uses biologically to regulate all three: blood volume, arterial elasticity, arterial radius, and heart rate. Those are, and there's a number of hormones that control salt, primarily through the kidney, through the renin-angiotensin syndrome, or system at least. And the majority of our blood pressure medications regulate the rate at which the heart pumps, the rate and the power of the heart. Beta blockers, for example, reduce that rate. The size of the blood vessels by affecting sodium channels, directly or indirectly, and blood volume, your diuretics. That's the way we control blood pressure. Now, what's the fly in the ointment? The modern fly in the ointment is damage to the walls of the blood vessels that narrow them or stiffen them up, number one, and number two is blood volume. In a younger person, damage to the blood vessels, to the arteries in particular, is not that important. It accumulates over time. So older people, once you get into your late 40s, 50s, and 60s, your risk of blood vascular conditioning problems goes up. We're going to talk about that in a second. But for everybody, whether you're a newborn baby, and remember, 2 to 5-year-olds are the fastest growing demographic of obesity, those kids are already dealing with hypertension, and it's volume-based hypertension, because there are two molecules that primarily control blood volume. Salt, obviously. Salt controls thirst, and salt is used by the kidneys and the colon to eliminate excess water from the human body. And salt, sodium chloride, is primarily an intravascular molecule. Yes, it's in our cells as well, but it's very constant, typically somewhere between 138 and 142, but the human body tightly controls your intravascular sodium because it's so closely tied to blood volume. And the body regulates that sodium, uses salt all the time to either retain water in the blood vascular space or eliminate water through the colon, through poop, or through urine, or through sweat. All of them are sodium volume controlled things and very tightly controlled. Now along comes another molecule that hasn't existed in the human species ever in abundance. And suddenly in the last 100 years, we're consuming massive amounts of this water-retaining molecule called glucose, fructose, galactose, sugar, glucose. For every molecule of glucose, you've got a molecule of water attached to it. So now, you drink that Coke, or you eat that pizza, or you eat that pasta, and what happens is for every molecule of glucose that your body absorbs, body is very efficient at absorbing glucose, very little sugar gets pooped out. Very little, what you eat, you retain. So you eat that sugar, it goes very rapidly into your blood system, and it sucks up a lot of water. It's like a sponge, sucks that water into your vascular space. Now you've over-distended your vascular space with sugar-containing water. So your heart's having to pump harder, the blood pressure goes up because of sugar. So what the body does is it uses salt to get you to pee that water out, diuretic effect, poop it out, but also what the body does is it shifts the sugar into your cells. And then the sugar gets converted to fat. That's where this comes from. This didn't come from too much steak or too much broccoli. It came from sugar. Okay? And the body converts that sugar to fat or stores some of the sugar as glycogen. Glycogen doesn't have a lot of water to it. So now you're left with this flood of excess water that is no longer controlled by sugar. And intracellular, your cells swell tremendously. Not so good for these cells to be flooded. And it damages the cells. So they become insulin resistant. They say, don't bring that sugar into my cells. But then all that volume builds up in your blood vascular space and your blood pressure goes through the roof. That, ladies and gentlemen, chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption is by far the most common cause of essential hypertension. To the point that right now here in this talk, I will tell you that if you look at essential hypertension as a category, less than 50%, I would say less than 20% of human beings truly have undiagnosable, we don't know what it is, hypertension. By far the majority of people with common and garden hypertension that get put on blood pressure medications by their doctors every single day have what's called carbophilic hypertension, sugar-loving hypertension, blood pressure that is directly caused by chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption. But the problem is most doctors say, well, you have to eat sugar because your brain needs sugar. And so what do they do? This is how completely screwed up healthcare is. It's ludicrous. They don't bat an eyelid with the amount of sugar and crap that you're eating, but they tell you that salt's bad for you. Oh, you got to be on a low salt diet. Low sodium, people. Don't eat salt. Most restaurants don't even have salt on the damn table anymore. Human beings have been using salt forever to manage our blood pressure and our blood volume. That is integral to being human. Now suddenly salt's bad for us? It's not. Salt is critically important to the human condition. It is sugar and starch that is the problem. Don't cut out the salt, cut out the sugar. And one of the coolest things in my practice when we get people to cut sugar out of their diet, cut carbohydrates out of their diet, those people on 3 or more blood pressure medications within a month or 2, if they do this correctly, can come down to 1 on average. And those people on anywhere from 1 to 3 blood pressure medications usually can come off all of their blood pressure medications within 3 to 6 months of cutting out carbohydrates, not because they just stop taking their medication, but because they don't need their medication. And the way we empower our patients is buy a cuff, check your blood pressure, write down the number every day. And if you're not eating carbohydrates and your blood pressure is coming down, back off on the medication. If your blood pressure stays normal, you don't need the medication. If it goes up, go back on the medication. Now, that needs, I believe, to be controlled by a physician who is comfortable de-prescribing, because there are other reasons why, there are other factors that blood pressure medication also affects. You may have pre-existing cardiovascular disease. And certainly in older people over the age of about 45 to 50, that chronic excessive consumption of carbohydrates starts to affect your blood vessels. And if you smoke or you use nicotine products, forget about it, because nicotine is as harmful, if not more harmful, to those blood vessels than sugar. Nicotine was the original reason why we ate so much sugar. Anyway, long story short, but the point is that as we get older, and in fact of the soldiers that died in Vietnam, the average age was 19, and all of them already had hardening of their blood vessels, or thickening or fixation of the elasticity of the blood. 19 years old. They were smoking and they were eating a lot of carbohydrates. So that disease starts early, but certainly 50s and 60s and older, the blood vessels themselves, the compliance, the movement of those blood vessels, they become stiffened up by the deposition of scarring that we call atherosclerosis, based upon the damage that chronically elevated levels of sugar and of nicotine, but primarily sugar, did to those blood vessels. That's for another talk. But there we have to monitor blood pressure much more carefully as we de-prescribe, because of the thickening of those blood vessels and the lack of compliance. But certainly your blood pressure comes down. And you want to avoid blood clots, you want to avoid aneurysms, you want to avoid damage to those blood vessels or complete blockage of those blood vessels. Get rid of the sugar, people. But understanding essential hypertension is so important, and most doctors do not have the foggiest damn idea. All they know is the latest rep that came to their office who brought the latest, sexiest blood pressure medication, that's the medication they're going to prescribe. Or they have some algorithm of drugs that they prescribe, but none of them talk to you about not eating sugar and eating more salt. In fact, if anything, they'll tell you to eat less fat and less salt, which is absolutely, totally, 100% the wrong information they can possibly give you. Human beings need salt, and salt will not cause your blood pressure to go up. Maybe by 5 or 10% in the face of massive amounts of carbohydrates, but never to the point it's going to cause you damage. And if anything, salt may cause your heart rate to go up slightly, but only in the context of carbohydrates. You get rid of the carbohydrates, your body needs salt. The consumption of salt will not cause hypertension or a faster heart rate. It doesn't do that. But your doctors believe it does, and they'll tell you all the time that it does. No, my friends, you caused your hypertension, you can make it go away. Get rid of the sugar, eat the salt. Monitor your pressure, take charge of your own life. I hope this helps.